Hello, everyone. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm joined today by who I hope will be a familiar face to most of you by now, Jake Wynn, our Director of Interpretation. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you, John. I feel like I'm on your talk show, and this is fantastic. I'm glad to not be the host today and talk about some cool history stuff.
Absolutely. That's what we do at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Lots of cool history stuff. We hope you all have been enjoying these videos that we've been posting. I know I'll speak for myself, and I think Jake feels the same way. It's been really fun to bring these to you. All the variety of shapes and sizes and formats they've come in. It really has been a lot of fun. And all part of our mission to emphasize that there is hope in history, there's some fun in history, there's inspiring stories in history, there's all of that and more that we can get across to you. So if you've enjoyed these, and if you enjoyed this one, please like the videos, please share the videos, help get more eyes on them and kind of spread our reach. And since the museum's doors are closed, it would mean the world to us if you're able, if you would consider donating or becoming a member, joining us in our mission to kind of continue telling the story of Civil War medicine. It's been thrilling to see people joining as members basically every day. And you, yes, you could be the next one. So please consider becoming a member if you can, or donating, or if you're not at a place where you can do any of that, liking the videos, sharing the videos, liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel. It's all incredibly helpful. So we'd love it to have you on board with us. So with all that said, we're here to talk more specifically about one of Jake's many excellent blog posts that grace the museum's blog. Both Jake and I have written quite a bit for the museum, and it has been kind of fun to go back and revisit some of our favorite posts. And when Jake sent this to me, so I edit the blog, and when Jake sent this to me, it was just such a cool story, I think. So it's called Beyond Consciousness and Pain, Dr. Morton and Anesthesia at the Battle of Spotsylvania. And you can find that on our website at civilwarmed.org/Spotsylvania, or we'll put the link in the comments below. So definitely check that out. And this will basically we'll kind of cover the main points from the blog and kind of go beyond it a little bit, perhaps. So to start things off, Jake, what was your inspiration for writing this post? How did you come across this story, and what made you sit down and be like, this is what I want to write about today?
Yeah, I don't actually really remember fully what inspired the post, but I've long been fascinated by the 1864 Overland Campaign, Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna River, Cold Harbor, and then on to Petersburg. So in the spring of 1864, is going to see some of the most vicious fighting of the American Civil War. Have a connection to that. I worked for a summer before I started full-time work at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine after graduating the summer of 2015. I spent the summer of 2015 working at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. I was one of their summer interns there, and one of my duty stations there was Spotsylvania Courthouse. And I always had an interest in that battle, but working there every day and spending so much time there really, it influenced me in many ways. And it's a very powerful battlefield. I think one that gets largely forgotten, especially if you compare it to some of the other major battlefields of the war, your Gettysburgs, your Antietam's, your Shiloh's, that sort of thing. Spotsylvania Courthouse kind of gets dropped down there. People kind of forget about it. And so I'm always focused on trying to, bring that battle to light, in particular because it was so horrific, it was so horrible, as most of the battles of the 1864 Overland Campaign were. And so since working at the museum, I've always tried to find some connections to that battle. And this is one that I kind of stumbled upon by accident. It wasn't an intentional. I wasn't going out seeking this story. The story kind of came to me. Yeah, it's one that I think is interesting. It cuts to the kind of core of our mission at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and one of our biggest myths that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and that is about anesthesia in the war. John, I know that you get this question a lot. I know that all of our staff and volunteers get asked about anesthesia in the Civil War quite a bit. And I think this post gets to the realities. This is based around primary sources, and shows that in reality, anesthesia was virtually universal. So it touches on a bunch of the things that we do at the museum and my interests personally. And that's kind of how I came around to writing it.
Yeah, I love that, and I especially love what you're saying about the power of place, especially during this time of COVID-19 and so many historical organizations doing really excellent kind of digital work. I think there might be kind of a temptation for people to say, well, I probably don't need to go visit these sites, but there is unquestionably, just like you said, and like you all were talking about with Jim Broomall weeks ago on one of our videos, and just kind of underscoring how really moving it is to just be there, and experience, what it's like to see the ground and all the things that you can't quite get digitally or even just reading about it.
Yeah, it's
So,
a particularly haunting place. I mean, again, after the pandemic is over, we can start getting back on the path towards normal life, whatever that will look like after this. I highly recommend on your next visit through Virginia, if you're heading down 95 and you want to make a stop, Fredericksburg Battlefield's great. So is Chancellorsville, the Wilderness. But I highly recommend. I always send people to Spotsylvania to walk along the former earthworks, and to visit the Bloody Angle, which sees some of the absolute most vicious fighting of the Civil War. Bloody hand-to-hand combat that went on for almost a full day, almost 24 hours of nonstop combat. It's a harrowing experience, a haunting place to visit.
absolutely. So let's start things off. Maybe give a brief overview about the Overland Campaign, the Battle of Spotsylvania, how we got here, and then we'll get into this really cool story that's at the center of the blog post.
Yeah, so in the spring of 1864, Union Army is preparing for its next campaign. They have a new kind of overall commander of the U.S. Army. That's General Grant. Ulysses Grant makes the decision to attach his headquarters to the most important of the Union armies, the Army of the Potomac. He's going to accompany that army on its march south, with the goal for this campaign, and this is kind of Grant's influence. Previously, commanders had been focused on trying to take Richmond. Grant is very focused on destroying Robert E. Lee's army. So his objective is to engage with the Army of Northern Virginia. In particular, he wants to engage them on ground of his choosing, not ground of Lee's choosing. Lee, engineer, very good at picking ground, very good at fighting on that defensive, kind of like an offensive defensive fighting style. And so Grant and Meade are going to launch a campaign in the spring of 64. May, they're going to cross over the Rappahannock and the Rapidan River and go into fighting, go into the Wilderness, this area just west of Fredericksburg, Virginia, that was fought over the previous May of 1863 at Chancellorsville. Heavy fighting in the Wilderness. Again, one of the most horrific battles of the war because of the fires that start. Are going to consume a lot of the wounded. There's a lot of dramatic stories that come out of the Wilderness. But then the armies move on, and this is where Grant kind of makes a play that no other previous commander in this theater of the war had done, and that is he virtually was defeated at the Battle of the Wilderness. His objectives are all checked. He can't move forward. Lee has blocked his path, and so instead of marching north and heading back across the river to fight again on another day, Grant makes the decision to move towards the south and east, and keeps his army on the move. And that is going to lead to Spotsylvania Courthouse. And one of the features of this campaign is that, and this is what's compelling to me, Because many of the battlefields you go to Gettysburg, Antietam, those places, there are some traces of the battle left behind, but by and large, it's empty fields. And what Wilderness and Spotsylvania have, and other battles in 1864, earthworks. They have actual connections to the past. And that's what Spotsylvania was so compelling to me, is both armies, as soon as they get there to Spotsylvania Courthouse, this crossroads, they dig in. And they dig in a way they hadn't quite done before. It starts to look more like World War I. And then it becomes an absolute slugging match against Union Army against the Confederate Army at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And the slaughter there on May 8th, May 10th, and May 12th, May 12th in particular, is unlike virtually any other experience during the Civil War for the soldiers who participated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you make a great point about how the earthworks, especially in 1864, start to become kind of a feature of a lot of Civil War battlefields. They exist on some other ones, like there are some earthworks at Gettysburg if you know where to look, but basically by 1864, it starts to become almost second nature to the soldiers. As soon as they stop marching, they just kind of start digging trenches. That just starts to become a habit. And because of that, they get to be more elaborate, much more well preserved, larger, and all that sort of stuff. And it really does kind of make that connection even more apparent than looking out across an open field. Like you can just physically see where some of the lines were. So talk about, every battle has some sort of medical challenges. What challenges were there with the Battle of Spotsylvania?
Yeah, so this gets to Grant's campaign and the strategy that's employed. So when the Army of the Potomac crosses the river and starts to move south, their idea was to have their supply depot kind of be back where they started at the Brandy Station Culpeper area. And because of Lee kind of blocking their path and the Army of the Potomac having to go around Lee's army towards the south and east, that means they have to leave their supply base behind. Basically, they're leaving the enemy in their dust and trying to head south, which means that their planned base is gone. So they have to adapt. And so that adaptation is going to be very painful. That means that the supply base for both getting supplies to the Army of the Potomac and receiving wounded from it is going to be at Fredericksburg. And there is this, constant effort of essentially convoys of ambulances going back and forth from the Wilderness battlefield. And then once the fighting starts at Spotsylvania, ferrying wounded to and from the battle. Now, I think it's just mind-boggling, the numbers here. So Union Army is going to have 10,000 plus wounded from the Wilderness, another 10,000 wounded from Spotsylvania Courthouse. And so all of those men are being ferried to Fredericksburg. And it's
which is not like super close.
What? Say that again, sorry.
What you mentioned, they're being ferried to Fredericksburg, which is not super close to where it's not forever away, but it's a journey.
Yeah, as we're talking about ambulances, I have an ambulance going by outside. Yeah, you're right. It's not super far, but it's not an easy distance. You're talking, by the roads, you're talking about 12 miles plus. Wilderness is farther; it's more like 20 miles. And the roads were not great. And during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, it starts to rain, and it turns the roads to quagmires, which is going to make the experience for the wounded soldier being traveling along those roads in ambulances, even the properly designed ambulances, of which there were are overwhelmed, and they're using regular army wagons as ambulances, which is extraordinarily unpleasant for the wounded soldiers. It's a terrible, terrible situation. And what ends up happening, and this kind of gets to the premise of this post, is that you're going to have not only the military surgeons and military medical personnel who are on the battlefield, but you're also going to get a host of volunteers who are coming to help, because this crisis is of such a size and complexity that had never really, even in places like Gettysburg, had never really been faced like this before, especially Gettysburg happened on Union territory, on Union terrain. This is happening deep in the heart of Virginia, which makes it even more difficult. So you get Clara Barton goes to the battlefield, goes to Fredericksburg to deal with some of the wounded as a nurse. And then you're going to get this character, Dr. William T.G. Morton, who is one of the founding pioneers of anesthetic use, not only in the United States, but of course around the world, revolutionizing the use of ether and as an anesthetic in the 1840s. He arrives in the aftermath of Spotsylvania to assist by administering anesthesia to all of the wounded from that battle, just to provide essentially an extra set of hands, some expertise of his own, and ensuring that soldiers who are awaiting surgical care are going to be under anesthesia.
Mm-hmm. And it can't be underscored enough just how revolutionary anesthesia was and this invented in the 1840s, 1846 or 48, one of the two. But it's incredibly revolutionary. I mean, it makes the impossible now possible. And we sort of take it for granted today. And even if it was around at the time of the Civil War, it's hard to kind of grasp how absolutely vital and kind of earth-shattering this was. And so Dr. Morton, basically the inventor of surgical anesthesia, heads to the battlefield and pitches in. And I kind of liken this to, if your computer breaks down, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs shows up to fix it, which, I mean, it's wild to me. So talk a little bit about his arrival, his involvement, and how that all happened.
Yeah, so Morton, and there's lots of arguments about who is really the first developer of anesthesia. I don't get too much into the post, but he gets essentially establishes a name as one of the pioneers of anesthesia, and he was, I don't want to say he was like a self-aggrandizer, but he kind of was. I mean, it's, I have found in a lot of pre-Civil War kind of inventors of new techniques or things in medicine, they sometimes come across as hucksters. They're like, they're really about that self-aggrandizement, and Morton has been accused of this as well, and kind of puffs himself up. There's a little bit of that in this story, but yeah, he's going to arrive after the Battle of the Wilderness is over, and then armies moved on to Spotsylvania, and he's going to show up. And by this time, the military medical system at Spotsylvania is already well overwhelmed with all of the casualties that are coming in. And so he's going to show up. I think one of the more, there's a lengthy quote in the piece that comes from a story that went out on the AP Newswire shortly after the Battle of Spotsylvania that kind of proclaims that Morton was there. I haven't been able to confirm this fully, but I suspect that with minor tweaks, they essentially published what Morton wrote about himself, which is fairly entertaining, I think. But what it does a great job, this piece does a great job of showing kind of what was faced at Spotsylvania, what was faced at any major battle engagement for the surgeons who are left to deal with the consequences of horrific battle. And so they're talking in this piece here about, that they have 2,000 cases that are going to need some form of anesthesia, either ether or chloroform, in the hospital that Morton had arrived in. And one of these, I use this article, I use this story as basis to talk about anesthetic use during the war. 95% of cases were surgical cases had anesthesia being used. And there's a quote in here from the medical director. I'm not sure which hospital that Morton is actually going to, but it quotes a medical director there, in which he's asked in what operations required ether to be used, and he responded, in every case. And that shows that's 2,000 cases that had been seen in this area of his control, and each of those were surgical cases that needed anesthesia. So that shows how much it's being used. But what I found interesting about Morton and his kind of role is they describe it pretty well in this story. And that is that he shows up shortly after a trove of about 300 Confederate wounded arrived in this hospital. And I'll just read this off. I highly recommend, if you're watching this, to go and read the article, because there's more detail in here that we can't get to. But quote in here says that day before yesterday, some 300 rebel wounded fell into our hands. Of these, 21 required capital operations. That means amputation. They were placed in a row, a slip of paper pinned to each man's coat collar telling the nature of the operation that had been decided upon. Dr. Morton passes along and with a towel saturated with ether puts every man beyond consciousness and pain. The operating surgeon follows and rapidly and skillfully amputates a leg or an arm, as the case may be, till the 21 had been subjected to the knife and saw without one twinge of pain. I think that does a pretty good job. Also showing a little bit of the triage idea in there about putting notes on each patient and kind of processing who is going to be cared for first, what the operation is going to be, and prioritizing who gets that treatment first.
There's so many great details in there. I'm glad you read that in its entirety. Just like you said, the little note about the notes being pinned to the patients, and the pervasive use of anesthesia, and the numbers that they're grappling with, and the fact that they have that much anesthesia available for not only that group but other groups. I mean, there's just it's a very, very rich quote. So I'm glad you read that, and it's, I think, one of the stars of the piece. Now, do we know, did Morton, had he been to other battlefields and done this, or did he go on to go to others? Do we know that?
Yeah, so we do know that he made attempts to go to other battlefields. He does talk about that a little bit, about maybe being at other battlefields in the wake of, sorry, truck outside, going in the wake of other battles to do this sort of work. But that's the most well described is the one at Spotsylvania. That's where he leaves behind this definite trail that you can follow, that kind of shows what he was doing, but also shows the work of maybe we can get into this with in kind of conversation. What role kind of anesthesia, and there's not really a job of anesthetist at this point, but he kind of fulfills that role. Has that specialty. And yeah, this campaign here at Spotsylvania shows kind of what Morton was capable of doing, and he didn't really bring much to the table other than being able to do to be really adept with anesthetic.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just another pair of hands too, for whatever. But yeah, no, absolutely. And for all the, I think, very likely self-aggrandizement on the part of Morton, at least he is at least doing, something to go out and kind of help ease the suffering of people on the front lines. So that's certainly laudable. And then you conclude the post with a pretty lengthy letter that Morton had written, which is kind of part of that paper trail that you were just talking about. Are there any other, because we just talked about how rich that quote from the newspaper is. Are there any bits in there that particularly jump out to you from the letter as being particularly juicy?
Yeah, so this is another area. He talks about kind of visiting the Army and arriving, and he kind of gets squired around to General Grant's headquarters, and he's kind of being given a tour of the front lines. He goes and he sees he can see the mule shoe salient. This is the Confederate position that is so strong, that is ultimately going to be pretty well broken on May 12th by Union assaults. But the Confederates then just simply create a new line and fortify that line. Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of juxtapose the newspaper article and its description against what Morton himself writes. Now, I have a suspicion that Morton may have written most of the story that went out on the AP Wire, because that's in multiple newspapers. You can find that. But this letter has some similar descriptions and gets into kind of what was being faced. So this gets to a good description, kind of firsthand account of some of the challenges that are being faced at Spotsylvania and in the Overland Campaign. So a little bit of a reading here. So he writes, quote, "Upon the arrival of a train of ambulances at a field hospital, the wounds are hastily examined, and those who can bear the journey are sent back once to Fredericksburg. The nature of the operations to be performed upon the others is then decided upon, and noted on a bit of paper pinned to the pillow or roll of blanket under each patient's head. When this had been done, I prepared the patients for the knife, producing perfect anesthesia in an average time of 3 minutes. And the operators followed, performing their operations with dexterous skill while the dressers in their turn bound up the stumps. It is surprising to see with what dexterity and rapidity surgical operations are performed by scores in about the same time really taken up with one case in peaceful regions." So again, there's kind of similar description to what goes out to the public in the newspapers, but you get some more details in here. And one of those is about the arrival of ambulances at the field hospital with the patients, and then again triage being described. Those patients that are ready to go to Fredericksburg, they send them on out. Those that need immediate surgical attention, they're going to be retained in the field hospitals at the battlefield, and they're going to operate upon them in a very quick fashion. And again, noting that they're putting pieces of paper to know what patient is getting what kind of operation, and ensuring who's going to be treated first. And then again, the skill of the surgeons being mentioned there. Shows that these surgeons, these doctors by 1864, they're really good. They have had a lot of experience, and Morton is going to know, he notes this in this letter, which is written on May 19th, 1864. So right at the tail end, just as the armies are beginning to move south again, Grant at the end of this battle is going to be stymied again. And so he's going to move south and east again. They're going to head down towards the North Anna River, get a little bit closer to Richmond.
And talking about the challenges, that further southward movement just continues to exacerbate the distance from Fredericksburg, where a lot of these wounded soldiers are being sent. So these problems, the challenges the medical department faces only get more intense as the campaign goes on. Yeah, and that's a great point, I think, that you made about kind of comparing and contrasting the newspaper versus his account, even if you maybe have suspicions they're the same, kind of noting what's similar, what's different, and all that sort of thing. That's, definitely something that, we as historians are trained to do. And I think it's a useful skill if you can get into thinking that way, not only when you're consulting historical sources as either a professional or an amateur, but also when consulting, even news sources and all sorts of information. It's definitely a useful filter to just kind of have in your mind, and I think that's well worth acknowledging here. So any further kind of comments, things that we missed that you want to make sure we cover about this post?
No, not too much. I would say if you get a chance, read the post in full. I think there are some tremendous descriptions from the primary sources, again, from that AP story, but also from Morton's letter in particular. There's a lot of great detail in there that provides. Again, I was not familiar with this, and I've read quite a bit about the Overland Campaign. I had not come across this letter previously, and it's got some details in there that are pretty great. I think there's a little puffery, especially about the part where he visits Grant's headquarters. But I think when he gets into the medical side and kind of the challenges that are being faced, I think it's very descriptive, very detailed, and it provides some context for this larger medical situation that is so terrible at this moment of the war, and shows what those doctors face, what the ambulance drivers face, the ambulance corps, basically everyone who is left to deal with the aftermath of these battles, which in many cases is described by many of the participants. The aftermath of the battle, in some cases, could be worse than the battle itself. Just because of having to actually grapple and deal with all of this carnage and these men torn apart by battle. In Spotsylvania, fighting is as vicious, if not more vicious, than any other battle of the war.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So as we wrap things up here, Jake, do you have any perhaps book recommendations? People have, of course, more time on their hands, maybe to do some reading, or if you're interested in this, you can read further. Any book recommendations about, anesthesia, this whole subject, or the Overland Campaign, or Spotsylvania?
Yeah, so if you're interested in these topics and kind of where medicine's at during the war, I always recommend, and this is not specific to the post, but it's kind of general, Dr. Shauna Devine's Learning from the Wounded is a fantastic book. Kind of gives you a great overview of where medicine is on the northern side during the conflict. And it's a fascinating read and helped me learn a lot about Civil War medicine. As for campaign studies, there's a really great one. Gordon Ray did a series of books on the Overland Campaign. He recently concluded that series. I think he's concluded it. Who knows? Might find another book in there. But his book about the wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse, North Anna and Cold Harbor, all the way to Petersburg. The series is fantastic. It is riveting. It'll carry you right through, and it gives some really rich detail about this moment in the war, what the consequences, what the objectives were, what the consequences were of these battles, and ultimately why we should really care about what happens between Washington and Richmond in the spring of 1864, because it really sets up the end of the conflict. It's going to set up the siege of Petersburg, and it really ushers in the bloodiest period of the conflict.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that series is just absolutely magnificent. Can't say enough about it. And the one on my end, it's so the series, it's, I don't know, the Gordon Ray series, 3 or 4 books or something, and each book is pretty hefty. It'll take you a bit to get through it. If you want a little bit more digestible, single volume book, which covers the Overland Campaign, I'd recommend. It's called And Keep Moving On by Mark Grimsley. That's a shorter single volume work that kind of covers the whole campaign. So
yeah, and if you're
just saw you pull another book there.
The Gordon Ray book about Spotsylvania, I realized that it's on the bookshelf right behind me. So show it off. So red cover. You get to see famous wounding from Spotsylvania on the cover as well. That is John Sedgwick. Famous last words. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance, and they socked him right below the eye.
Yeah, that's a tough way to go.
Tough way to go indeed.
But hey, at least they were memorable last words. That counts for something.
Definitely gone down in, I would say, infamy.
Yes, but if I have to die some sort of whatever death I have to die, I would, I think, enjoy my last words being deeply ironic, because people would never forget them.
That is too true, John. Too true.
Anyway, on that lovely morbid note, we're going to wrap things up here. Thanks so much for watching. Go check out the blog post, check out the website, check out our Facebook page, our YouTube channel. We're posting digital content as fastly and furiously as we can, and we hope you've all been enjoying it. If you have, please consider becoming a member and supporting our mission, supporting programming like this and others. If you can't become a member, or if you already are a member, a quick donation really kind of helps boost us. It's really beneficial, and we thank you so much. We've been overwhelmed by your generosity so far. So thank you to all who have given, and we'd encourage you to do so if you haven't yet. So this is John and Jake signing off, and we'll see you next time.